Hello and welcome to On the Kerbs Pub Chat. I'm one of your hosts, Thiemo Albers-Daly, and this time around I'm joined by resident Haas expert Henry Wallace. How are you?
I'm doing well, Timo. How are you?
Doing pretty good, thank you. And it's your first time on the podcast, and as you're in my international pub, first things first, what's your poison?
Well, I would love to pay homage to the hit TV series Bottom and have an Esther Ranson, or even a pint of beer in a half pint glass. But I think for the sake of ease, I'll just take a bottle of Newcastle Brown Ale, please.
It's an excellent reference, and we can maybe sort you out with an Esther Ranson after the podcast when it's slightly easier. But for now, you'll just have to make do with your Newcastle Brown Ale, which is not a bad choice either. But I'm sure that'll keep you happy.
It certainly will.
Right, we're going to get down to business because, as mentioned, Haas expert that you are, we're going to talk about Haas. And the one question that we're pretty much going to try and have some kind of an answer to is, can Haas win an F1 World Championship? And before we look ahead to the future, we're going to have a brief look back in time and essentially just see how they've done over the last few years or so. They've been in Formula One for a bit longer than you might think if you're just carefully looking at it, because they seem like it's only the other year that they joined, but it was 2016, and it's kind of they're getting close to the 10-year mark, which is quite remarkable because we weren't sure if Haas were going to be able to make it that long when we first had them on board, and I'm sure that things would be very different for you if they hadn't. But we're going to have a quick look back at have a quick look back at the results that we say in 2016. As a team, P8 overall with 29 points, best result of fifth with Grosjean in Bahrain. 2017, again P8, but more points, 47 this time. Sixth in Austria with Grosjean again was their best result. It's interesting how Grosjean comes into this quite a bit there. I feel like he's a driver that, for many a reason, could be overlooked because of just being in Haas and Haas in the later years when he was there. So it's interesting to go back and look at those early years in particular to see that they did all right with him just to begin with. And maybe we were a little bit cruel, but we'll get to that. 2018, they jumped to P5 overall with 93 points, best result of fourth with Grosjean, again in Austria. We're going to come back to that one later because it's an interesting point of fourth appears to be the best that Haas can do so far. 2019, back down the other way, P9 overall, 29 points with best result of sixth with Magnus in Australia, which was the opening round of that year. So that was a bit of a tough year. 2020, again, P9 made 2019 look rather nice by comparison because they only got 3 points that year with the best result of P9 with Grosjean in Germany. 2021, we know all about that. P10 overall, nil points with the best result of P12 with Schumacher in Hungary. And then last year, bouncing back a little bit and potentially giving us something to get excited about. P8 overall, 37 points, best result of P5 with Magnussen in Bahrain, plus obviously that excellent pole position in Brazil. And we're recording this just before the Singapore Grand Prix. So they're currently P8 this year with 11 points, best result of P7 with Hulkenberg in Australia. And the last crucial point there that I've got is Max and Hulkenberg have been secured at Haas for 2024. So before we look into the future, how would you rate Haas's kind of performance from 2016 till now? There's definitely been some roller coaster elements to it.
It certainly has been a roller coaster. They actually started in 2014, and then they took 2 years to actually make their first delvings into actually getting onto the grid. So they had a run up of 2 years. They were going to enter in 2015, but then there was a regulation change in 2016. So they thought, well, what's the point in starting a year and then having to completely change
Exactly.
over again? So they started then, and I think going straight in as a rookie at P8, I think that's pretty honourable.
It's not bad.
To be fair, no, it's really not. And you take it was Grosjean and Esteban Gutierrez, and Gutierrez, he infamously took out Fernando Alonso in the opening race in Australia, and Grosjean, I think he finished something like sixth, which was one of those things that I think not a lot of people on the grid were really expecting for one of these teams who are effectively buying parts of a shelf. And
So, including Haas, mind you, they probably weren't expecting it themselves. They probably saw Gutierrez and thought, yeah, that's probably about as what we were expecting for this, just a little more dramatic.
well, no, definitely. And I think considering the experience that Guenther had had in Formula One, he'd had the time in NASCAR. Um, So he hadn't been in F1 for a few years at that point. So actually to come back in and smash out P8 and just shy of 30 points, I think is pretty good. And yeah, it has been a bit of a roller coaster, obviously going all the way up to the heady heights of P5, halfway in the table, to crashing back down into 2021, the year that we will never mention.
Well, it's as
But
well with 2020 though, as they're kind of already going downhill there, which was well, 2020 and 2019. It was kind of interesting to see because we kind of see that Haas, they're very impressive. They've jumped up to P5. Like maybe at worst they'll go P6, P7, but there's always a tight midfield battle going on, and you never know what's going to happen. But obviously, we're not going to talk about it too much because there's not much to talk about with it anyway. But 2021 definitely didn't help them, but it kind of did help them to bounce back for 22 and so far 23 in terms of we're going to sacrifice this year and hope for the best. But you kind of hope for their sake they could maybe get P7, but with how Williams are doing at the moment, it seems tricky at best, shall we say, and they would
I
need
mean,
not necessarily luck,
yeah.
but they do need a bit of that on their side, along with a couple of things, and it opens up the question of their qualifying pace is definitely there. We've seen that with Hulkenberg a lot, but in the race, they don't seem to have that focused on development too much. And like you were saying, for a team that came in 2016 buying parts from everywhere else, not really doing much themselves in the manufacturing side of it, not too badly. But by this point, I'm curious to ask you rather, are you surprised that they haven't kind of gone down more of a let's try and make some of our own bits already, or are you not surprised that they're keeping with a program that's, I guess, kind of working for them?
I mean, I'm kind of not surprised that they're keeping with the program that seems to have been doing something for them. I think if you go back to 2019, that was the infamous year of Rich Energy. It was an amazing looking livery, but it was the most horrendous funding situation that Haas could ever hope for, because
I don't know what you mean.
they were promised a whole load of money from William Story, um, but they didn't see half of it. I think it was something in the region of about $50 million, and
Hmm.
I don't even think that they managed to even secure 20 from them. So, I mean, going from 2019 into 2020, that's where you see that dip. You see an enormous um, dip in terms of performance and in accruing points, because their ability to be able to manufacture and to upgrade parts on the car as the seasons in that particular window of technical regulations progressed, they just really couldn't do anything. And Gene has having to pump in, as people may attest to Drive to Survive, $100 million of Gene Haas's own money. That's going to start to wear a little bit thin. Whether it's been an issue that's been inherent within that business plan, I'm not entirely sure if it is. It is interesting that they have got the facilities, and obviously they own all of these Haas automation machines to be able to make all of these parts, but they're not necessarily using them to make their own. But then again, they're they've been the team on the grid that's had the least amount of money. Maybe, I mean, what I'm not entirely sure about what Williams's financial situation has been over the last few years. I'm not sure whether they're under
It's
Haas
been
or they're
patchy.
just above.
It's been kind of,
Yeah,
if you look at some of what comes out of there now in terms of we're doing some stock taking and looking at what we've got, and oh my days, this is quite outdated technology. How the hell have we been
yeah,
doing what we've been doing for so long? It's kind of not necessarily comparable. It's just a different kind of bad.
yeah. I mean, but then they've got the pedigree, they've got the history, and they're the fan base behind
More
them.
likely to get someone to take a punt on them who's not going to necessarily screw them over
Yeah,
because it's
exactly.
Williams.
Exactly. They're a team that's been going for countless years now, with m- many world championships to their name, with fabulous drivers like Nigel Mansell and Ayrton Senna to their name. And Haas have had five drivers, six drivers: Magnussen, Grosjean, Pin, Gutierrez, and now Hulkenberg. So they've had six drivers in, what was it? Let's do the math, 7 years. They've not had those heritage names. They've not had, apart from, you could argue, Schumacher. but that's an entirely different
Well,
conversation.
you raise an interesting point there that I want to latch onto there because after their donking performance to get to P5, it seems that that would have been the perfect opportunity to try and maybe lure one of these heritage names, as you say, into the team and help perhaps build the team around them so that they can get success that way. And instead, what they got was a very costly lesson in double check and triple check everything before you bring a big title sponsor on board and make sure that you can get at least some of the money up front so that even if something like this does happen, it's potentially damage limitation there because I think that if the upward trend that Haas are on or appear to be on now and over the next few years can continue, then when they get back up to that position, they're going to be a lot more selective about who they let in. Because I don't think Gene wants to be spending more of his own money again if something happens on that side of things. And
No,
it does bring me to a point I want to raise later, but I'll leave that for a tease for now. But it does bring up the question of what is possible for them before 2026 because they've got a stable driver lineup now, and it looks like that there's no reason why that couldn't continue into 2025 at least. And if you were going to change anything because of the regulations, 2026 would seem maybe the time to do that, where you could still get experienced drivers, but just younger and maybe drivers that you could get to stay in the sport with you longer than Magnusson or Hulkenberg may want to. Depends on a number of factors. And you've obviously still got Guenther there. We've seen that the most successful teams in recent years in F1 have had a very consistent line of personnel. You look at Toto, you look at Christian, for example, and Zach has been kind of successful. It depends how we measure it. Not quite on their side of things, but it's not gotten worse than where they were. So we'll take that as a win. Whereas all these other teams have been kind of fluctuating a bit, and you see some very interesting results there. So before 2026, how far up do you think that they can get? Because we saw with previous set of regulations how by 2021 everyone got pretty close. I mean, yes, Red Bull and Mercedes were definitely the two out front, but you could maybe attribute that more to the drivers in those cars in Hamilton and Verstappen, and you still saw AlphaTauri, Aston Martin, Alpine, McLaren, Ferrari all on the podium at various points in the year, winning even with Ricciardo in Monza. So, can they close up the gap? And if they can close up the gap, how much of a challenge is that for them to keep that going in 26?
I would say that it would be a mighty challenge to get up to the likes of above P6 and upwards. I think considering the fact that the technical directives so far have been either arguably good for the sport or arguably not so good for the sport. Nevertheless, it's not gone particularly in Haas's way in terms of stuff like tyre degradation. I mean, we're pretty positive, you know, despite the current situation with the car, that Haas can improve. We've seen Williams shoot up from dead last all the way to P7 in the past few 4, 5, 6 races. I don't think it's out of the question that Haas can improve. There's many rumours going around, of course, with Haas, because they're one of these teams that seems to get muddled into drama left, right, and centre, whether it's with sponsors.
And they never do anything to invite that kind of stuff to them either. So it's really curious how this keeps happening.
I mean, we'll gloss over all the stuff that Ralph Schumacher seems to write about or talk to journalists about their treatment of Michael Schumacher. I don't
Just ignore Ralph Schumacher generally, to be honest. It seems easier.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't think I don't think it's entirely impossible that Haas can improve. There are things like the rumours about Alfa Romeo becoming another sponsor. Once their time with Sauber comes to an end at the end of this year, there could potentially be another helpful cash injection right there. I mean, these rumours are always going to be around, but I always see it as it's never going to be true unless it's announced by the team. They've never been on the podium.
You've been very close to having a Will Buxton style quote there, but continue.
Yeah, I could have done. The first person to cross the line is the winner.
It's never official until it is. I'm glad you pointed that one out. But do continue. I feel like I've interrupted your train of thought. Go on.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Haas have never been on the podium, which is not nice to think about because literally other team has multiple to their names. However, although we haven't had a particularly wild season so far, when it has come to podiums, and I'm not sure if many people are expecting Alpine to have two P3s, one especially in Monaco of all places.
I think no one's more surprised than Alpine.
Well, yeah, Esti Besti was on the podium, baby. I tried to sound like a bit like Austin Powers there, but that didn't really work. That unflattering dead silence. That is something that I aspire to achieve in every
I'll see if I
podcast.
can find some comedic music to put in that comedic silence instead of crickets chirping, perhaps.
I think considering the uncertainty surrounding on what on earth is going on with Alpine's management, if the foundation is there for a team, anything is possible. If you read or heard what Kevin Magnussen said about after Monza this year, he said we have a very steep hill to climb. I don't think anybody would be hard pressed to come to the conclusion that Haas are in a bit of a rut. I'm seeing a lot of comments going around like, just give them a good car, or Guenther needs to go, Steiner out. And although I don't want to be one of those people to shy away from fair criticism, do people not really believe that Haas are trying their best with what they have? I think it's all very well to compare them to other teams like Red Bull or Mercedes, but Haas are in no way comparable, in my opinion. Being able to support names like Adrian Newey is just something that is completely out of the question for Haas at the moment because they don't have the resources like those other teams. The likes of those teams have enormous facilities, endless supply of readily available parts within the cost cap. But if we take, for example, something like aero design, other teams like Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, they use one-to-one scale models of what the car is going to be like. And Haas, they use a 1-to-5 scale, which people who may not necessarily be aware of like how scales work be thinking, well, that doesn't matter. They've just got a smaller car. They can still look at the aerodynamics. But if you think about air molecules, don't change in size. They don't get to fit to their original size when you put them in a wind tunnel. That's going to have a pretty monumental impact on actually how airflow moves over the car. And this has come to finance and how and where do Haas get the money in.
Well, that leads me into an interesting thing I wanted to pay off on my tease from earlier to see what you think about this, because everyone's talking about Andretti as another American team coming in, and some people are saying that they should join with Haas and make some big super American outfit. Personally, I don't think they should. I like the idea of a brand new team being there. But if Andretti's going to be there with all its might and potentially with Cadillac supporting it, you've got a big powerhouse already there. I'm curious to see what something like Haas Chip Ganassi powerhouse would look like and bring them in some form with the team because, like you say, funding is the main problem here. You've seen what the Stroll dynasty, for lack of a better term, there have been able to do for Aston Martin, and you've seen what corporate money has been able to help Williams with so far, and at least figuring out what's going wrong with them and to try and get them back on the right path. So maybe they do need, maybe another big American name that's embedded in motorsport would be the way to go. And I'm curious, would you be keen to see Chip Ganassi partner up with them?
I would be more keen to have something that's. I mean, Chip Ganassi would be a good option, and we might talk about this later. I think, considering we're thinking about 2026, who are Red Bull teaming up with in 2026 for their engine powertrains? They're teaming up with Ford, and who do Haas already have a relationship with within NASCAR? It's Ford. They run Ford cars. For my money, it would kind of make more sense to go with Ford, considering that the relationship is already there with the name. And if Red Bull are going to be using Ford powertrains, and according to Christian Horner, can supply up to 4 different teams as well as their
I
own.
see you're trying to find a loophole here. Excellent.
Why isn't there something? Why is that not a conversation that's being had? Or maybe it is, I don't know. But I think for me, that seems to make the most sense. Okay, they've had the relationship with Ferrari for however many years they've had now. But if they're,
It's not come to much in the grand scheme of things, and Ferrari can't even sort themselves out, so you
and
couldn't blame them
if
if
you
they were looking at someone else.
and if you think reliability, generally you don't think Ferrari, you think of Mercedes, and Red Bull certainly this year
Hmm.
has had an immensely reliable powertrain. It's through Honda, but okay, they can manage a car well and they know how far to push a car. But Ferrari, they turn it up to like 95%, and there's a chance that it's going to go pop. I'm not sure if Haas should rely on this Italian link that they've got. I wonder if it would be better for them to move to more familiar home turf. And it would further strengthen the relationship between the NASCAR side and the Formula One side for Gene Haas, and potentially, solidify his interest in remaining within F1 altogether.
The one spanner I'll throw in your work there is the thing of, even if Red Bull are willing to supply to other teams, they've got to make sure that they're not just going to do it out of the kindness of their hearts. I'm not even sure if they've got some of that, depending on the day of the week. Just looking at
Topical
Marco
humor.
in
I love it.
particular.
No.
And you just got to think, again, money being the problem there. If it's an outright, I want to buy what you've got so I can stick it in my Haas car, then okay, chances are they're probably not going to beat Red Bull straight out the gate anyway. It's going to have a lot
No.
of things going wrong with Red Bull for that to happen. But they're still going to want paying for it. And where's that money going to come from? Maybe, like you say, Alfa Romeo comes in. You've got this weird triple bill of Ford / Red Bull partnering up with Alfa Romeo Haas. Or is this a sort of thing where, for the sake of it never hurts to have more promotion, that's where your likes of Chip Ganassi would come in to be purely, here's some money, do what you need to do. And as F1's getting bigger and bigger in America, if you can make Haas even remotely competitive again, that's good for Chip Ganassi, because it then opens up the door for them potentially down the line. And Andretti have some American competition so that they can say, we're not just going to beat or aim to beat all these mega teams in Formula One itself, but we're going to be the best American team. And you've got something for all the American teams to really sink, or American fans rather, to really sink their teeth into, plus the added satisfaction of taking it to Chip Ganassi, because, who doesn't like a bit of that rivalry? So I think just from a money side of things, that's the only issue there. But I'm not against this idea of looking at Ford going back to a relationship that's familiar and working for them in another series. It's just the Red Bull component of that I'm not sure about how far that could go if they are talking about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do take your point. I mean, Guenther Steiner and Christian Horner were working together. Guenther Steiner was the technical director at the beginning of Red Bull when they started in Formula One. He was underneath. Should I rephrase that? He was working
We're
under.
already going there, just going off with
That picture surface that's online side. Do you remember the one in the
yes.
team in the team principals interviews?
The conference, yeah.
Yeah. So Guenther Steiner has already worked under the likes of Christian Horner. He already kind of knows that relationship and how each other can work. And as far as I can work out, they don't tend to kind of badmouth each other. If anything, it's Toto and Guenther that badmouth each other, but in like a friendly, bantery way. So I could kind of see that would be I do think it could be a viable option, because that relationship again is already there. I think the issue could be in the fact that it is a brand new set of technical directives about the powertrain, and if anything's to go by, what we saw from the likes of Mercedes at the beginning of 2022 when the aero regulations were in and everyone was talking about let's go porpoising. Issues from a brand new set of regulations can very easily crop up. And if you've gone for a brand new engine supplier, that could go very wrong. And you could, I don't know, it could even go down the routes of potentially like McLaren Honda days, which I don't really think anyone wants to see. But is that a risk that's worth it? Because
Well,
it's
if they're
with
still
a
sticking in
strong team.
P8, P7, then they've not got much to lose by chancing it, really. They already know what rock bottom looks like,
Yeah.
2021. So they know how to deal with it, and they know that they can find a way to bounce back from it. They're definitely not a team that's unused to turbulent times. And the last thing before we move on slightly that I want to just throw in there as an option, which is a bit left field, because I much preferred this to be a Williams partnership if it did happen, but Porsche Haas, if you want reliability, go German.
Porsche has. Oh yeah, I mean you could do because there was that chat earlier in the year, wasn't there, about Porsche entering the
And
F1
everyone
scene?
liked the idea of it being with Williams because it just seemed to roll off the tongue nicely. You could imagine the liveries would be excellent, and there was just a lot of
Yeah, it would
there was a
be.
lot to like about that. But again, Haas is a left field team at the best of times, and this would be a very left field thing for them to somehow pull off and then succeed at. So, and again, if you've got Hulkenberg there, if he's at least expressing interest in Audi for 26, is that a
Mm.
way to keep him for a year or two at least and make sure that your new partners are happy because you've got a German driver for the now partly German team?
I mean, potentially, it's not like Porsche are unused to being in the world of motorsport. I
Exactly.
mean, they've got a heritage within motorsport as long as your arm. Um, I mean, potentially, yeah. It would be interesting to see how that dynamic between the two companies would work. But I don't think it could be. I don't kind of really want to rule anything out. I think the only thing I'd like to rule out is that has to leave the sport entirely. But I didn't say that, and I'm never going to say it.
Well, that's all
No.
right then. We can move back onto this year a bit because it's kind of we got excited at the start of 2022. We had the excellent return to form for Magnussen in Bahrain
Mm,
with a P5. It went a little bit
superb.
downhill from there, but again, we got Brazil. We got a little bit of chaos here and there with sprint race weekends. They seem to do well at because it was a shorter race. I guess there was less time for them to fall down the order. But you got to take the points where you can get it. Whereas this year, they've just kind of like you say, it's just not been the most exciting season. So there's not been much for them to take advantage of there, and they can't really prove themselves if they can make the right call at the right time in order to get close to the podium, or wildly even Alpine have done it. They could get on it. I mean, I don't know who's predicting that for which Grand Prix. I mean, the only one I can picture it happening is Las Vegas because it's going to be nuts there anyway, probably if they can
Yeah.
survive whatever carnage comes. But it's kind of, are they just hampered as much as anyone else is by just the reliability and the Verstappen domination that there's not nothing to fight for behind P1, but there's less oomph to this season.
Yeah, I mean, I think like everyone who isn't a Verstappen fan, you're just discounting P1 straight away. You're not even entering it into the the ravages of your mind. If you saw that meme of a guy who puts up a piece of masking tape on the left hand side of his screen with P1 moved down to P2, so he can look at the rest of the grid, and P1 is completely irrelevant, and it's almost like Max Verstappen isn't even there. I think that it's been it certainly has been tricky, but the one thing I would say is that Haas has had an exceptionally good qualifying car. How many times has Nico Hulkenberg managed to get it into Q3? I think he's had more times in Q3 than Checo. Certainly after Silverstone, that it might have gone one up on Checo now.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
Checo's woken up finally, so it's gone back the other way. But
Finally,
the fact that it got there in the beginning is testament
yeah.
to Haas and Hulkenberg by himself and shows that okay, the Red Bull is a good car, but imagine what a different driver in there could do. Imagine if you put Hulkenberg in that Red Bull just for races to see what would happen.
I've seen a few people say get Hulkenberg in the Red Bull because he is absolutely dominating in a back marker. And yeah, this
It's going to
car
be
is an
fun choosing a
amazing.
title for this podcast. We're going to have all sorts: Porsche, Haas, Hulkenberg to Red Bull, Chip Ganassi to enter Formula One. We're going to be spoiled for choice here.
We certainly are. Um, and if Haas has had a particularly good qualifying car, but its race pace over 60, 70 laps has just not been great. And to go back to what K-Mag said is that yes, there is an enormous hill to climb, but they're very confident with the team in itself. And I think it's all very well saying that the car is not good, but actually, if the team isn't there to support it, you've got even less of a chance. And there are these rumors flying around now that Haas are bringing a version of a Red Bull for Kota. So could this completely change the outlook for the rest of this year in terms of where a Haas laying? Could
I
they
think
do a
you're getting
Williams?
optimistic now, but I'm not going to stop you.
Please let me have something. I don't have much. I need to have something to look forward to in my life.
I mean, I'd love to see it. It'd be nice to have the tail end of the season get interesting. We've got some great venues coming up for it, and generally the tail end of a season the last couple of years has been quite spicy. So I wouldn't be against Haas somehow randomly spoiling the party for everyone and everyone scratching their heads going, how the hell have they done that? But I'm just making sure that you don't set yourself up too
Oh
much
no,
just
no,
in
no, no,
case.
no. Again, like I said earlier, it's a rumor. It's not true unless the team says something or they've come out with something. I think Nico could stay at Haas beyond 2024. Hey Mag, I'm not so sure. He's got a kid that's under a year old at the moment, and I'm a father to be, and I'm sure that there's a real big tug to get out of the intensity of the F1 calendar to spend time with your family. But then you've got other questions surrounding Kevin Magnussen about who would replace him. Would they lean on Ferrari for drivers more? Or if they do a deal with another manufacturer for engines or aero or parts or something, would they then look to other avenues? Could they have somebody like Checo? Could they afford someone like Checo? I mean, he's had these moments with Red Bull that have been superb. He's also had moments with Red Bull that have been not so great. And it's clear that Haas is not the team to take on rookies without real reason. We saw that in 2021 with Mazepin. Maybe someone like Giovinazzi could even get Arthur Leclerc in the Haas, if that's even an avenue. We did see Charles Leclerc in a Haas.
Yeah, I suppose it's the trouble with rookies not being on the top of the list for them after 2021, which you can understand. So I'm thinking if you're not likely to get someone like Checo, where do you go if you don't want a rookie, but you can't afford someone from the sharp end of the grid? Do you look at someone again, assuming they're either still in the sport or at least if they've moved over to IndyCar or something like this? So we're again speculating a little bit on where some drivers end up in the next few years. But do you go for someone like Logan Sargent? Maybe you have an American driver who's got a little. He's not a rookie, but at least at that point he'd have a couple of years in theory under his belt.
Mm.
Do you go for Joe Guan Yu? Do you go and try and see if you can get Liam Lawson? I mean, Red Bull have a copious amount of Red Bull juniors, and they're not all going to get into an AlphaTauri, never mind a Red Bull. So, do you try and see, okay, who's got the odd race here or there? Who can we pinch that has experience, even if not necessarily in Formula One? They're not going to be a rookie in the same way that previous rookies have been rookies.
Mm.
So, I don't think that they'll be in a situation where they'll have to leave the sport anytime soon. I think they just need to knuckle down, and they've got personnel, it would seem, or they're at least in the process of getting people that they need, but everyone else seems to be pretty happy with what they've got. They
Mm.
know they're a small outfit. They're a little bit like Force India back
Yeah,
before
yeah.
all of the other kind of non-Force India stuff came into it in terms of how are you doing that with such a small amount of everything.
Where's your
Um,
money? Where's your money actually coming from?
well,
Are you paying
that's
the
not
right
important
taxes?
right now. Point is, results matter and nothing else does. So it'd be,
So, your name's not Guenther. Rips off the mask. VJ, it's you again.
to be honest, I would not be against that as a comeback. That would be a great plot twist and would be very fitting for
wasn't
Haas.
wasn't he in the paddock at the beginning of the year, VJ?
I think someone's got to report him if he was, because I'm not sure if he's
I
meant to be.
I feel like I saw a picture of him in the paddock.
There might have been someone with a poster or a Mission Impossible mask. You need to double check that. Um,
I
but
don't know.
I think it would just be a shame if Haas had to partner up with Andretti or had to partner up with another team that was looking to come in some way. That's why I quite like the idea of Alfa Romeo or Chip Ganassi or something along those lines, where
I
you're getting
agree.
help, but you're not taking the potential of another team off the F1 grid, because I still think we could do with one or two more teams. It'd be more interesting. And you've got this extra dynamic of rivalry. Everyone's like, oh, what can Andretti bring to Formula One? It's like, well, you've got an American rivalry in your sport then. That isn't just
Yeah,
between
yeah,
Logan Sargent versus Haas as your American battle. That seems a bit
yeah, yeah.
eh. Whereas if you put Logan Sargent in Haas after a couple of years, maybe that could be interesting. Who knows?
And I mean,
Maybe you stick
to
Colton
be
Herta and
fair,
Andretti. Figure it out.
I don't think Logan Sargent's actually doing too bad a job. Okay, he's had a couple of offs, but I kind of think that's to be expected in a rookie year.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
know,
again, by their
Yuki
rookie standards
Tsunoda had
for Haas,
plenty of them.
they happily take him. So
Yuki Tsunoda had plenty of offs, but people still really like Yuki Tsunoda. But I don't know if that's just a personality thing or if
and
that
so
is a
that
driving
brings up a
thing.
different question for another time. I think of are drivers actually good or do you just like them?
Well,
But
yeah, that's
it's
entirely the thing.
but it's an interesting thing there because I don't think that Haas is going to be going anywhere. They definitely seem to be sticking around. They're going to dig their nails in,
Mm,
but I think 2026. The only reason I'm curious about maybe that being their best shot at a title attempt was because it's the only time really where if you can nail it, you could you could get a one-off fairy tale championship, and a little bit like Braun in 2009. If that season had been a bit longer, it might have been Red Bulls. But because of it being just the right amount of races and because they were able to capitalize on this loophole early on before that, and no one else had realized, they were able to give us one of the best seasons of Formula One. So I know it may not be that simple, but if I'm going to borrow some of your optimism about Haas for later this year and just project it a few years down the line, I think that could be maybe Haas's best shot there. I mean, look how happy we were when came fifth in Bahrain last year. We thought, okay, new regs, Haas has somehow managed to do this, and we were all really on board for it because it was something different, it's something unexpected. So
yeah, yeah.
if that was just a tease of what they could do in 4 years' time at that point, then bring it on.
I couldn't agree with you more. I wouldn't want to see somebody like the likes of Andretti moving in to just completely buy out Haas in itself. I think if Andretti needs to come in or want to come in, it definitely needs to be on as their own team. And I'm not entirely sure if I'm such a fan of the other teams blocking a new team
Mm.
entering. I know it's like tied up in politics about like gentlemen's agreements and Concord agreements and the divide of prize money and how far do you take it to change the point system within the top 10? Do you move it to top 11 or top 12 so it's a bit more competition and all this other nonsense? But it would be really nice for Haas to remain as they are. I think they are going to remain as they are. It's a bit tricky because they're spread over three different countries. They've got all of the um the marketing and their HR and financial stuff over in Canapolis. Then they've got the factory in Banbury, and then they've got Dallara and their shared space at Maranello with Ferrari. It's a bit spread, and if Andretti want to come in, I think it could be a bit tricky for them to remain solely in the States. It would be beneficial for them to have somewhere based in Europe too, but that's not completely out of the question.
No, and I then want to get your thoughts on 2026. And is that for you their best attempt at a title shot, or is it just not that simple?
I don't think it's that simple. I mean, it. I would be a fool to say that Haas isn't going to go in every year with an attempt, or at least a a desire to attempt podiums, wins, and a championship. Exceptionally optimistic, but I'm going to hold on to that optimism. It would be interesting to see how 2026 plays out. Like you say, will it turn out to be like the greatest season that's ever entered the scale of Formula One in 2009? Is it going to be like that, or is it going to be more of the same? It's so difficult to predict at this
But it's also
point in
a
time.
bit I want to point out there that not necessarily has come in capitalizing the rules so perfectly that they run away with it, but just is it their best shot at a title attempt? Because face it, at this point, they would be satisfied with consistent podiums and an occasional race win at the very most. If they could do that in 26 as a starting off point, even if it takes another year or two for all the other teams to be absolutely on it, if they can play their cards just right, they'd still be perfectly happy with that. And you think, okay, we've clearly done something okay here. This gives us enough leeway that we won't fall back to the bottom of the grid immediately. So we might
Mm.
actually be able to pull something off here. But so by best shot at a title attempt doesn't mean they have to win it as much as
But
you
at
might
least,
definitely want that. But
but at
it does
least
at least
certainly
get them
trying to.
on the podium and better than a P4 with Grosjean.
Yeah, I do. I do think it's definitely going to be their best attempt. Gene Haas never set out for the team to ever be going into the sport with the intent of winning all the time. He just wanted to be competitive. And so did Guenther, really. Not only did Guenther want a job within Europe, but he wanted to be a part of the sport that he loved
I
so
think he
much.
potentially saw what Red Bull had done when he was there and like, oh, look
Yeah.
at the full team coming in and just doing all of this. Imagine if I can do that and I'm the common factor. And okay, it's not quite worked out, but I admired the balls on his end if he was thinking that.
Well, definitely, and we'll never really be privy to exactly what sorts of conversations Gunter and Gene have over the phone, and it's always going to be over the phone if the memes are right. Um, but it's definitely going to be their best attempt. I mean, I think it does depend on, do they stay with Ferrari for the regulations? Do they keep that relationship? Do they move it to somewhere else? Do they bring in a fresh face the the drivers market, or do they stick with K-Mag and Nico for the long term? Do where does the money go? Does it go into what most teams do and they continually develop over the year, or do they continue with what they did in the previous years, and where they would make big upgrades infrequently? Gunter said that he was never a fan of constantly bringing little upgrades because the little upgrades could soon lead to a much bigger problem. And currently, as we're seeing it, the car this year has had a lot of upgrades and is pretty shocking in terms of its reliability. Silverstone, it died twice the same weekend, the same car. The aero package, will it necessarily work because they've got such a small scale model that they have to work with? They don't have the simulators in England where the drivers are. They have them in Maranello. So they've got to fly out to Italy to do a day's worth of sim and then go all the way back to the factory in Banbury to then make the setup adjustments and stuff like that. I mean, would we go down the roads of what Aston Martin have managed to do this year, or what McLaren or Williams have done in the previous 4, 5, 6 races? I don't think you can take anything out, it would be interesting to see if this thing at Kota actually does happen. Because if it does happen and it works, then clearly there's something that other teams might need to be looking at. I mean, I was a bit worried when Aston Martin were talking about how they were going to absolutely dominate 2023, and they came out and it actually happened, and they were doing a phenomenal job at getting onto the podium into the top five. It did almost kind of make me feel like, is there something we're missing? Have they found a loophole that shouldn't be there? Have they
Yeah, they sent
done
Stroll into
something
Red Bull and no one
untoward?
noticed he was there whilst he was taking pictures because he's just so unnoticeable that they came
Like,
back and like, look what I've got.
how could you miss Lance Stroll with those eyebrows?
Oh, he shaved those, and weirdly that
Oh,
didn't get
okay.
more looks. I was just thinking it's one of those things like if the SRB19, if you want to call it,
Mm.
is true, it's going to be very interesting to see is that then something that is great for the rest of this season after Kota, and they have a massively excellent by their own standards tail end to 2023, and then 2024 comes and we're back to square one again because everyone else is upgrading. We're like, nice try, Haas. We're not going to let you do that. Or is it something that they can then continue on with? And I think going back to what you were saying there about how spread out they are with everything, it would just be so much easier if they could find somewhere to just centralize everything. And I feel like that in itself would just solve a lot of their issues because just time, money, any chances of miscommunication, all these kind of little details are just taken care of. And I feel like once you have those things sorted out, the bigger things are just so much easier to handle. You might not solve them immediately as you might want to, but you wouldn't do that anyway. But you'd get the solution that would actually help you a lot quicker. And
Mm.
we've seen that now that they've got MoneyGram, who seem to be happy to stay there. I mean, you've got a little bit to say on that in a second from who you're talking to, but they seem to be sticking around, and that's good from everyone's perspective there. It's nice to finally have someone who's going to stick around for more than a year with no controversy. Maybe shouldn't have said that because we haven't got to the end of the year yet, but we'll just go with that.
Thanks, Thiemo. Thank you very
You know
much.
who to blame. Um, and I think if that's going to be something where we've seen Williams really developing on the interactive side of F1 with the fans, if Haas can do that as well, that really helps draw in more money from elsewhere. So they don't necessarily need another title sponsor, but they can get lots of little ones here and there and not necessarily crowdfund themselves, but do the F1 equivalent of it. And it tops up the money that MoneyGram give them so that even if like Guenther and Gene say they're not necessarily keen on lots of little developments but rather big ones, it means that they can definitely do the big ones thanks to MoneyGram, and then they have the option to do these smaller ones here or there to
Yeah,
try
yeah.
things out because they've just been able to marketize things a lot better and more efficiently that it just naturally has that money coming in. And I think once they've got the organizational side of things sorted a little more, and if we believe Magnussen, it seems to be they're heading down the right track there, then all the other things kind of fit into place. It does very much seem like they've got the majority of the puzzle pieces. They've got decent drivers, they've got management that's proven to work, they've got title sponsor, they've got a car that isn't awful and just needs a little bit of fine tuning here or there. Because I mean, if you still look at how close it is to the rest of the grid from first to 20th over a qualifying session, it's incredibly close. And if you can just upgrade the race spec slightly, who knows what you can
Mm.
do there, especially when you've got two experienced drivers in the car, or even if you've got a slightly less experienced driver, but still an experienced driver in there, you could be then seeing. I'm not even sure where the limit would be initially. You've got to think that P4 is the limit for now because of just how powerful Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari are. Because even at
Yeah.
their worst, Ferrari seem to be still P5, P6 at worst. So
Yeah,
they
yeah.
still do all right. Whereas Haas, if they can capitalize on this and do what McLaren and Williams and Alpine and Aston Martin have been doing this year, then they kind of can leave AlphaTauri and Alfa Romeo Sauber behind them and really get their teeth sunk into that mid pack fight. And it could just be it's there's so much potential there, and it feels like the last time we got that 2018 year. And it's just making sure that once this happens again, which I'm going to jump on your hype train a little bit, let's say it does, then it's all about keeping it on the track and in every sense of the word, metaphor and otherwise, instead of just kind of driving it off a cliff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if there's anything that a Haas can do in terms of bringing, its own little innovative bits to further produce a car that is much more competitive within the field. I mean, at the beginning of the year, we remember the tiny pit lane wall that Haas brought that had like 3 seats, and everyone was like, "Oh, you can only afford this many," but actually, it saved them $250,000 a year in moving a pit wall around, which is something that they really need because they don't have
Again, it's kind of a
that
move
sort of.
straight out of a Force India or a Jordan kind of book of, yeah, sod it will look a bit silly, but look how much
Yeah,
money
but
we've saved out of it and what we can do with that money instead.
exactly, doesn't matter. I mean, it's how many times have we heard the sorts of things from F1 designers about we don't care if it's ugly, it just needs to be quick, really. And I
Against the
think if
cars in 2015 and 2016, I think, was it, with the questionable front
oh,
noses?
oh man alive, I don't even want to think about them, to be fair. They're just they were something else, but they worked for
They
the
were
time.
something else. They weren't noses,
But
that's for certain.
I I heard a lot of people talking about Haas just needs to make it like a fast car, as if it's like flicking on a light switch. To say like making an F1 car is like really easy. You don't. You need the proper facilities. You need the right staff. You need the good partnerships for engines and parts. But I do think it's entirely possible that this could work. And I mean, you were talking about kind of like consolidating their bases. I think it would go back to the thing that we were talking about earlier with potentially a partnership should be done with Red Bull and Ford, then immediately you're taking away a base in Italy and you're not having to expend money on getting your drivers or your staff or parts to Italy. It's there already with Red Bull. And then, I mean, this AlphaTauri thing with Hugo Boss, I'm not entirely sure as to the details as to how far that's being taken away from Red Bull, whether Red Bull are completely selling it or if it's just the name that's just being bought and it's
Yeah, you're going to
still
be a little bit
under the.
pissed if you're a Red Bull Junior driver and that's suddenly distancing itself from Red Bull,
Yeah,
but that's
yeah,
a
yeah.
separate conversation.
All of a sudden, Haas seems a lot more attractive. Maybe they should
Hmm.
continue with that going on.
Or just
But
steal
it's
Hugo Boss as a sponsor. There you go.
or just or just do
Can you
that.
imagine Guenther doing a Hugo Boss advert and just having you remember the adverts did, what was it, for Little Rowdy, and then 2 years later he's doing it for Hugo Boss with the sunglasses on?
I mean, that is
I
a
think you all want to see that now, no?
that's a glow up. If ever I saw one,
How big's
what?
that boat?
Oh yeah, exactly. And Matt, they could smell really nice in the paddock instead of the smelling of F1 cars and fuel and rubber down on the track is nice enough anyway. But tie that in with a really good eau de toilette, a match made in heaven, I think.
I think to try and formulate some kind of final thoughts on this then is a slight oversimplification, but and potentially a more tongue-in-cheek one. But I think what we've concluded here is that can Haas win an F1 World Championship? The answer we appear to have got to is definitely maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, definitely maybe.
And
It,
2026 might be the time to do it. And I think going back to what you were saying just now before, or the Hugo Boss business, that if they can consolidate everything and sort out these smaller issues now, as they appear to be doing with, like, oh, if we just make the pit wall smaller, we've got 250,000. What else are we missing that's like that can help us in the short term? Because when we can afford it, who gives a toss? We can spend all the money we want on anything then. But until then,
yeah,
we've got to scrimp and save and be really clever and sneaky about it because it's still within the rule book that we can do this. So I think if well, they're not saying that they should sacrifice any progress up the grid between now and 2026, but I think if they're looking for the bigger picture, have some people go on gardening leave from other teams that maybe do focus on car design and have them just contemplating in their own free time, but not actually working on anything on the 2026 car, and have them available towards the mid of 2025 when they can actually start building these things. Then between now and then, they've got that one eye in the future, and they've got the other eye looking at right now in perfecting all these little itsy bits and pieces, so that when they've got everything else lined up from the bigger side of things, like the car's spec'd up, the drivers are glued in and know what's going on, then they can really nail it.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think that's fair to say that it's definitely their best chance at getting nearer a title fight in 2026 if they can really capitalize on what they've got now and develop it further in such a way that it doesn't overshadow the progress that they have made so far. Because from if you look from 2020, when they were dead in the water, and then 2021 they just completely sacked off in time for the new regulations. If this is a road that they're going to go down again, could there be an even bigger jump? I would
It
like
really
to
depends on how the
think
other
so.
teams do. I mean, again, you were mentioning Alpine
That's
there
it.
earlier. No one was expecting them to get P3s earlier in the year, and that's with the chaos management going on there. If they've got all their ducks in a row, at least 8 out of 10 of them, then you could potentially that's Alpine, AlphaTauri, or whatever the hell we call it at that point, and Sauber potentially, because we can't imagine that Audi's going to come in straight away and be on it. That's 3 teams already. That's minimum P7 you've got to be aiming for, which is at the very worst for them already where they are.
Yes. We're P8 at the moment.
I'm being
We're
optimistic for you, and Williams are going to go P6.
well, yeah. I mean, that could entirely happen. I think if we can move up a stage this year, get to P7 for the end of this year, and then maybe stay there for 2024 and 2025 in the sort of P7, P8
P7, but
range.
then be fighting for P6, but just narrowly
Yeah,
lose out on it.
yeah. I mean, Alfa Romeo, they're currently a point. Is it a point behind? Yeah, it is. They're only a point behind us now, and they're P9. So if we can make a big jump quickly, then definitely we're going to start the year with a much more significant advantage. Although we lose in the wind tunnel, the money is the most important thing for Haas, because if they don't
Hmm.
have the money, then all you get is a rich energy situation, and you just fall down into the fiery pits of hell. And that is a place I would not want to see Haas going anytime soon.
On that cheery note, that's all we've got time for in this edition of On the Curbs Pub Chat. If you want more from Henry and I, details of where you can find the pair of us will be in the description of this episode. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Hopefully, we've sparked a few of them, as well as on socials, and we'll be back soon with another episode. Henry, shall we go and grab another pint?
Only if you're paying. And can I have a packet of cheesy moments as well?
I'll see what I can do.